In this lesson, we will continue working with the student class that we created in the previous lesson. If you did not create that class or did not complete the assignment, you should import the gradebook project so that you have code that gets you started. We're going to begin by looking at some alternative ways to modify our existing student class. Up till now, we have assigned all of our values in the constructor by assigning each instance variable a value within that constructor. But there is an alternative way to initialize a variable. And it is very similar to how we have done things in the past. When declaring the variable, we can give it an initial value. And if we do that, we no longer need to set its value in the constructor. So we can do the same thing for our last and for our grade. And what this effectively means is that we can eliminate the default constructor because up till now it has all of our variables. This version of the code has the extra credit gender variable assigned as well. Now notice that when we're assigning a value to gender, we can use the actual value and set it to 0. However, we can also use and should also use, whenever it makes sense, the constant values that we created because it's less ambiguous. This makes it clear what gender is being assigned, whereas 0 might be ambiguous. And as your code gets longer and longer, this becomes more and more true. So we've now initialized all of our instance variables. We don't need a default constructor anymore. We still need our overloaded constructor, which allows us to set each of these variables. However, we can see that gender gets set automatically up here, so we can eliminate that from this constructor. What we might also want to do, though, is give the ability to set the gender within a constructor. So we copy and paste and add all the same variables, but this time also add a set gender variable. And if we're doing that, then we want to make sure that the gender is set to a valid value. Now in this instance, there's only 2 possible values, so we can use an if statement to guarantee that we get a good value. One way to do it would be to simply initialize it. It's already set to male, so all we have to do is determine if setGender is female. If setGender is gender female, then we want to set the gender variable equal to gender female. Now, why do we write it in this slightly odd fashion? Well, what happens if somebody tries to give us a set gender value of -1 or 3? Both values that are not acceptable. Well, what happens? First, our gender is set to male by default, and then this if statement does not get executed, so if we get past a bad value, we simply get the default result of male. And if it bothers you that the default is male, how can we make it so the default is female? Well, all we need to do is change the gender male value to 1 and the gender female value to 0. Now, the question is, does our code still work? Well, if we go down to our gender method, notice that I said gender is equal to gender male, or is gender equal to gender male, in which case it returns male, otherwise it returns female. So our code should still work in exactly the same way it has before, even though we've now changed these values. And this is why we use constants and why we should be careful to use them whenever possible in our assignments and not use their actual values, because it allows us to modify the code later. Okay, so let's look at what else we might want to change. Let's see, I do believe that we have everything we need in here to begin the next lesson. Okay, so what's next? Well, as you may have guessed from the name of the project, this is supposed to be a gradebook, and a gradebook would have multiple students in it. So let's begin by creating a class that will act as our new driver class for the gradebook project. So we're going to go to default package, and we're going to create a new class which we'll call gradebook driver, which will give public static void main. Okay, so how could we give ourselves a list of students instead of just one? Well, as we've already learned, there's a mechanism for creating groups of things in Java, and it's called an array. So how do I create an array of students? Well, I first declare what my array is made up of. In this case, student, and then I say that it is an array. Next comes the name of the array, so I'm going to call it students, and then I use the keyword operator new, and again it's an array of student, and I need to say how many students are going to be in my array. So I'm going to start with 5 students. Now, one little detail is that you may be confused into thinking that you've just created 5 or instantiated 5 student objects. However, let's do a little experiment here. Let's do a for loop for int I equals 0, I is less than students dot length, I plus plus, and then let's do a system dot out dot println students I dot get first. Now, what do we expect to happen when we run this? If you guessed that you're going to actually see a null pointer exception, congratulations. Why is it a null pointer exception? Well, this array is filled with the values null. Let's change this so we actually just print students I and proceed with running our program. By the way, why are we getting this error every time saying there's errors that need to be fixed? Well, we modified our student class and got rid of the default constructor. So how could we put that back in so that we don't get that error? We can simply put a stub constructor. Student and that should take care of that problem. Notice this constructor doesn't do anything, but it's sitting there in case we needed it to do something later. Okay, so as we've just established, when we run this, we can see that our array has 5 null values. So what we need to do is actually create some students to fill our array. So let's begin. How do we create a new student? Well, the way we did it before is student and then create a variable for it. Let's go with s equals new student, and then I call my constructor. So right now I have my constructor takes, let's see, we should review first, last, grade, and gender. So first name will be my name. I'm going to say that I'm in the 12th grade, and then I'm going to assign a gender. Now let's remember that if we want to access a class constant, I do that by using the class name, and then I can assign the gender using the constant. However, is this new student S in my array? And the answer, of course, is it is not. So how do I add it to the array? Well, I could do students 0 equals S, and that will assign it to the array. So now let's print or run our program again, and notice this time I get Aaron Braskin as my first element. Why did Aaron Braskin come up? Well, if you'll recall, in my students class, I overrode the toString method, which is in here somewhere, so that it prints first space last. And since my gradebook driver program simply printed students array I, it called the toString method. And when there was a null value, it printed null. Now let's look at another way that I could add another student to my array. I could say students 1 equals new student, and let's give him complete information. Okay, and this eliminates one step in the process. I simply skipped the step of creating it as a separate variable and put it directly into the array. Now I run it, and we can see that I have my second student in the list. Okay, so at this point, I would like you to go ahead and fill in the rest of the values. So we need 2, 3, and 4. Go ahead and make up some names. Give them different grades, and why don't you make it a mix of male and female. Let's see, we need to change this one. Let's make it okay, and we need one more. Let's go with different name here. Okay, and I want that to be gender female. Okay, so now when I run my program, I have my list of students here. Okay, so far we have simply created an array, and within the array we've filled it with each value getting a student object, and then we've printed each individual array element, which had the effect of calling the toString method. What if I wanted to see what grade each student was in? Well, I could add a plus is A, and students I dot. Now, let's see, we have a grade method that should give us the grade as a string. Let's see if that works. There we go. So we've now added a little bit more functionality. Now at some point you might say it gets a little tiresome typing this all the time, and the more times I'm going to type it, the less helpful it's going to be want to be putting it in each time. So if I wanted to, I can do what is sort of referred to or generally referred to as dereferencing the variable. I could say student S equals students I, and then within my code here I can shorten this considerably by just putting S and S.grade. And I've done something wrong. Oh, I already used student S. Let's go ahead and change this so that it follows the same format as the others. Let's get rid of that, and then down here put in that, and then I can get rid of this declaration, and now I can use S again. Okay, so notice that it doesn't change anything. All I've done is I've taken one element out of my array, assigned it to a temporary variable, which is the variable that makes up each element of the array, and then I can use it within my loop here to do anything I want. So, for example, I can add a system out print line and say s.get first plus is in grade plus s dot get grade. And the difference between the s.grade and s.getGrade is that this one returns an integer value, the grade level, and let's see, let's also make it, let's put after the person's name an indicator of their gender. And what I want to do is just put the first letter of their gender within parentheses. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to start by printing my left parentheses, then I'm going to print my s.gender.substring, and I'm going to do my substring begin and end, which is going to be 0 and 1, plus my close parentheses. Oops, don't need that. There we go. And now when I run this, I get Aaron Braskin is male, Ken Brennan is male, Greg Thompson is male, Jenna Bowlby is female, and Brandy Gaunt is female. So, as you can see, since s.gender returns a string, I can then use string methods to manipulate it. Okay, this works. This gives us an array with some elements in it. However, let's start thinking a little bit larger in terms of how we can create a gradebook that will take care of some things for us. For example, is there any way for me to add a new student to this little gradebook after I've created it? In other words, if I wanted to have another student, I would have to go through and add a new element to the array and modify my program quite a bit. What we want to do is create a class that will do all of that work for us. So we're now going to create a new class called Gradebook. It's not going to have a main method. It's going to be a class just like our student class. And the Gradebook class is going to use the student class, but its job is to actually function as a complete gradebook. So the question is, what would the first instance variable be in this gradebook? Well, the first instance variable would be an array of students. And I've just declared it. Now what I need to do is set up my constructor, which is going to be, oh, I left off a keyword. What did I forget? Private. Very important. Okay, private students. Now I need my constructor, which is going to be public gradebook. And I'm not going to have a default constructor right now. We might add one later. We'll see. But for right now, what we're going to say is that when it's time to create a new gradebook, well, actually, yeah, we aren't going to need a constructor at all at this point in the program. We're going to start right in by creating a method by which we can add a new student to our gradebook. And now things are going to get a little bit complicated because we're going to have to do some very creative management of our array. And the first question is, what value does students have right now? I've declared it as an array, but notice I didn't do what we usually do, which is say new student and then give it some number of students. So what value does it have? Well, I can make it explicit. and I'll say it has the value null. Null means that currently there are no students. So what do we do next? We're going to create a method that lets us add a student to our gradebook. So we're going to call it public, it's going to be void, and we're going to call it add student. And what parameter is it going to take? Well, not surprisingly, it's going to take a student. Actually, we're going to take the parameters that make up a student. So we're going to take a string first, string last, an int grade level, and an int gender. Okay, so these variables will give us the information to create our new student. So let's go ahead and do that. Student s equals new student first, last, grade level, and gender. Well, that was easy, because remember, our student class has a constructor that does all the rest of the work for us. Now all we need to do is add this student to our array. But we have a problem. Our array doesn't have any room in it. Currently, it's null. So the very first thing we're going to do is say, if students is null, then we're going to do something. What are we going to do? We're going to say students equals new student array 1. We're going to create an array of one element so that we have a place to put our new student. And then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to assign students 0 equal to s. We're going to put our new student into the first element of the array. Question is, are we done? Well, it would be a very small gradebook if you were only ever allowed to have one student. So what happens if there's already a student in the gradebook and we try and add one? Well, in that case, students will not be null anymore. So we can say else. Now, students is not null, so we need to deal with that situation. We have an array of some number of elements at this point. If we've added one student, we have only one element. But we want this to work for any number of elements. So what we're going to have to do is create a new array that's large enough to hold one more student than the current array so that we can copy each student into the new array. So let's recall how we do that. First, we're going to create a new student array. New array equals new student, and then I have to decide how many elements go into this array. Well, the answer is the number of students currently plus 1. Okay, now what I need to do is copy each value from my old array to my new array. So for int I equals 0, I is less than students dot length, I plus plus, and now I am ready to do some copying. I'm going to say new array of I equals students of I. Okay, and when I'm done, my new array has all the students from my old array, but remember there's one blank spot at the end because we made the new array one notch larger, one student larger. So how do we put our new student into that array? Well, very simply, we say new array students dot length equals s. Because remember, s is our new student that we created within this method. Now, why did I use students.length? because remember students.length is one less than the total of the new students. I could just as easily, and it might be more clear if I said new array dot length minus 1, which is the same as saying put it at the end of the array in the very last spot. Okay, so now I have added a student to this array. We just have one little problem. This is great, I can add a student, but how do I get a student out of my array? Well, that can be accomplished simply by creating a method that does it for us. So public student, because it's going to return a specific student, and we're going to call it get, and then we're going to say, well, what student number do you want? So it's going to be the index of the student you're looking for. Okay, now we have to do a few things. First, we might want to make sure that index is a valid value. So index has to be greater than or equal to 0. So if index is less than 0, or index is greater than students.length minus 1, then what do we do? Well, they've requested a student from our array. If they request a student that doesn't exist, what value can we return to let them know that they have requested a bad value? Well, one way to do it would be to return null. That makes sure that they get a nothing back. Okay. Another way to deal with the situation would be to throw an exception, but we haven't covered that yet. So we're going to stick with this for right now as the solution. All right, so if they give us a bad index value, our method will immediately stop without doing anything but returning null. If we get past that line, then we know index is a good value. So all we have to do is return the students array element pointed to by index. Okay, now we've got our gradebook. So let's go back to our gradebook driver and see how we can use our new class. So I'm going to keep my code here down below for right now and start by creating a new gradebook, which I will call gradebook equals new gradebook. Okay, now what do I need to do next? Well, now what I need to do is add a student to my gradebook. So I'm going to say gradebook dot add student, and now I can fill in these values. So here I can copy and paste from my code down below, and that should work. All right, now what I want to do is see how many, or print the student that is in my gradebook. So I could do a system.out.println gradebook dot get, and what's the index of the first student? Well, it has to be 0. Okay, let's run it. Let's put a little system out above it. System.out.println that says gradebook. And down here, let's say this is just an array of students. Okay, so now we run it, and we have, hopefully, gradebook has Aaron Braskin in it. Okay, so our gradebook has successfully added our first student. Now let's try adding a second student. This one will be Ken Brennan. And we'll put that in there. Now the question becomes, how do I print out Ken Brennan? Well, I can simply change my get to 1, and I should see Gradebook has Aaron Braskin and null, which means that I've done something wrong in my Gradebook code. Let's see if we can figure out what it is. So, if students is not null, oh, I know what I did. I left off one very important step. What's the last thing I need to do before I'm done is I need to make my students array equal to my new array. So I replace students with new array, which, by the way, has the effect of deleting the old students array. Okay, let's save that, go back to Gradebook driver, and hopefully this time we will see our Gradebook has Ken Brennan and Aaron Braskin. Okay, so we're going to take a moment now to fill in the rest of our Gradebook add students before we move on to the next step. So I'm going to copy my other students up here. And that will let me that'll give me my Gradebook that has 5 students in it. And at this point, we are going to go ahead and delete this old version where we were manually manipulating the array and just stick with this version. Okay, so how can I make it so that instead of having to manually output every individual student, which I could do by copying and pasting, but would get very tiresome once we have a class full of students, how can I make it so that I can do that similar to the way that we've done it with our array? Well, what do we have that makes it possible for us to step through arrays? One thing we have is something that tells us how many elements are in it. So we're going to have a public int, and we're going to call it, for arrays, they call it length. We're going to use a different name for it, and there's a reason for that that we'll get to in the next lesson. We're going to call it size. And the size method is going to be very simple. It's going to return an integer that tells us how many students we currently have. Well, if students is null, how many students do we have? We have 0. Otherwise, how many students do we have? We have the number of students currently in the array. And this is a very important little check here, this students equals null. It makes sure that if I go back to my Gradebook driver here, and now I do systemout.println up here, there are Gradebook.size students in the Gradebook, and then I do it again down here at the end. Notice that it says there are 0 students in the Gradebook, which is correct because at this point we haven't added any students. And that works because I took the time, whoops, wrong method, wrong class, took the time to check to make sure students was not null. If I simply did this, if I got rid of this and only had that, what would happen when I ran my Gradebook driver? Notice I get a null pointer exception because it tries to print out the length of the array, but my array doesn't exist at that point. It's null. So it's very important to keep track of whether or not a variable actually exists within your program. Okay, so now that we've guaranteed that that problem won't happen, we will go on to our next step. How can I make it so I actually print all the students in my gradebook? Because right now I'm only printing the first two. Well, now that I have a size method, I can write my own loop. So for int I equals 0, I is less than gradebook dot size, I plus plus, and now I can output student I. Okay, and notice that what I have just done is given a way to access an element of the array and a way to find out how many elements are in the array. But I have hidden all of those operations from the programmer who's using the gradebook program. They may not even realize that there's an array behind the scenes here. And that is an important advantage of object-oriented programming. It's what they call code protection or data hiding. Okay, so let's run it and see if it works. All right, here we go. Aaron Braskin, Ken Brennan, Greg Thompson, Jenna Bowlby, and Brandy Gaunt. Now, in our previous version, before we deleted the extra code though, we wanted to be able to do things like get more information about our student. So let's look at how we can do that. So here, let's say that we do student s equals gradebook dot get I. Oops. So now I've pulled out a student. So now I can print that student, and just like before, I can add my parentheses and say student.gender.substring 0, 1 plus my close parentheses. So now I've made it so that it will print out the gender after each student in my gradebook, and I could also then add is a student dot grade. Okay, so now I get, notice how easy it was to simply change my program to add extra information. Okay, so now let's add another method to our gradebook. At the end of the year, every student in our gradebook is going to be advanced 1 year automatically. So how do we make that happen? Well, we're going to go into our gradebook class and we're going to create a new method. Public void, we're going to call it graduate. And what the graduate class will do is take each student in the gradebook and move them up 1 year. So how do we do that? Well, we simply go through, first we test to make sure that our student array is not null. So if it's not null, we'll actually do something. In this case, we're checking to make sure there's actual values in the array, and then only doing something if it has something in it. We could just as easily turn it around and say if students equals null, return, because notice that we're returning a void, so we can return with nothing else after it. You can choose either of these ways to write it. Let's leave that one. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to go through our array. I is less than students.length, and for each student we're going to say student s equals students of I. This gives us access, and what we're doing is we're just creating a student that making it easier for us to work with that student within our loop. So we're going to say, first I need to find out what grade level the student is in. So I am going to say int grade equals s dot get grade. Then I'm going to take that grade and I'm going to increase it by 1. And then I'm going to put the new grade level back in. So set grade, grade. Okay. And now I can go to my gradebook right here, and I can now, let's add a new line here, and let's say system.out.println everyone celebrates at graduation, and we're going to say, oops, gradebook dot graduate. Then we're going to print the gradebook again. So, oops, there we go. Copy all of that code, paste it back in there, and let's run it. Now, let's look at what happened. So, notice that I was a senior, Ken was a senior, Greg was a junior, so let's look at what happened. Somehow I stayed a senior, Ken stayed a senior, Greg got advanced, he's a senior, and we can see that Jenna became a sophomore and Brandy became a junior. So why did that happen? Well, let's recall that in our student class we put a limit. What happens if you try to set a grade beyond the 12th grade? It is impossible. So what we need to do is consider how we can modify our gradebook to take into account what has just happened. So let's see, what can we do? Okay, so we can put in here an if. Well, if grade is greater than 12, then we want to do something. Else, we want to update the grade. So this allows us to stop and say, wait a minute, they're a senior, they've just graduated. What should we do? And your first thought might be, and it's not a bad one, is we should take them out of the gradebook. So how would we do that? Well, we would say gradebook I equals null, or why didn't that work? Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not gradebook, it's students. But remember, we've set student S equal to students I, so we could just as easily say S equals null. Now, what's going to happen? Let's run our gradebook driver and see what happens. So, we got first our initial run. I am a senior, Ken is a senior. Then Aaron stayed a senior, Ken stayed a senior, and Greg was graduated. So why didn't it work? Well, here's where we want to look at going back to our original value. Let's change, by changing S to null, we didn't actually erase it from the array, because when we set a variable to null, Java simply lets that memory location go. But if there's a copy that still exists somewhere, it doesn't get deleted. And in this case, there's still a copy in the array. So we want to go back to this version where we actually eliminate that element from the array. Okay, so now let's save it and let's run our gradebook driver and see if we get the results we were expecting. So this time we got null pointer exception, and we got that basically here. The gradebook worked for the first time, and then when it tried to print the second one, notice that we got a null pointer exception. Well, why? Because we erased one of the values within our gradebook. And so our gradebook program returned a null value, and our gradebook driver tried to use s.gender to a null value. So this reveals a weakness in the solution of simply setting it to null. What we really want to do is remove that person from the array. And just as we did up here, where we added an element to the array, we can do a similar process. Well, how do we do that? Okay, let's add a new public method that is going to be void, and this is going to be the remove method. And it's going to also take an index. Okay, so just like before, we're going to want to do a few check procedures. So the first one, oh, that reminds me, I think I actually skipped over something. What happens if you try and do a get when the gradebook has no students in it? So actually, we need to add another condition up here. This should say if students is equal to null, or the index is a bad value. Little detail there. Okay, so back to our program. Here we go. Now we need to remove a student from our array. So we're going to say, first, check. We can use the same line to check to make sure our students array has something in it. So if students is equal to null, then we're going to return. In this case, though, we're returning void, so we don't have anything after the return statement. We also want to return if the index is less than 0, and we want to return if the index is greater than the length minus 1. Okay? Let's see. So now that we've taken care of that checking, what do we want to do next? Well, next what we want to do is remove an element from an array. And removing an element from an array is slightly more complex than adding one to it, but the process is not that different. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create an array that is one smaller than the array that we're working with. And because we're going to do that, we might want to add one other check here. What if students.length is equal to 1? Well, in that case, we have a special situation. If there's only one student in the gradebook, and it's the last student and we're removing them, what should we do? We don't actually we can't shrink the array from 1 to nothing, so what we do is we set it back to null, meaning that it ceases to exist. In all other cases, however, we're going to do the actual process of removing the array. So we're going to create a new students array that's going to be equal to a new array of students. How many elements are going to be in the array? Well, students.length minus 1. So we've removed 1 from the list. Oh, that should be student, not students. Okay. So I now have a new array that has 1 less element in it. The first thing I want to do is copy all of the students up to the index that I'm trying to remove. So I'm going to write a for loop that says for int I is equal to, well, okay, so here's how the easiest way to do this. What we want to do is we want to go through the array and copy each element of the array, skipping the element that we are removing. So we could say int I equals 0, I is less than new, students dot length, and then I plus plus. Okay, and what I'm going to do is if the student is not the index that I'm trying to remove, then I want to copy them. So if I is not equal to index, then I'm going to copy this student to the new array. But where am I going to put them in the new array? Well, the short answer is I need to create a new counter, new integer, and I'm going to call this new array index, starts at 0, and I'm going to put the new student in the new array, new student, or new array index, equal to students at I. So what I'm doing is I'm copying each student from the students array. But if it turns out that the student is the one that I'm removing, I'm going to skip them. And where I'm placing them in the new array is going to change at a different rate than the for loop. So the next thing I need to do is increment my new array index by 1. And in this way, I will copy only the students that I'm trying to copy to the new array. And when I'm done, I can say students equals new array. Okay, this should work. So let's go to our graduate. And now, if the grade is equal to 12, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to remove this student from the list. So I'm going to say students, remove, and my index is going to be I. However, this creates one new problem. Let's consider the logic here. I remove the first student from my list because if you recall, I was the first student in the list and I was a senior. So it tries to graduate me, my grade goes up by 1, it becomes greater than 12, and it removes me from the list. Well, what's just happened to the size of my array? We've just shrunk it by 1 element. So can I continue through the rest of this array? There's fewer elements here. So what I need to do to make sure that I step through and don't run into this problem is a neat little trick. I start with the last student in the list, and I subtract 1, and I go as long as I is greater than or equal to 0, and each time I subtract 1 from I. Now all I've done is reverse the order. So let's think about what happens now. I graduate a student, but I start with the last student in the list. Well, now I've removed them from the list. Okay, is that going to disrupt my array? Well, since I'm going backwards through the list, I will have simply moved to the next student. And so it won't it won't corrupt the integrity of my list. That should solve our problem. Okay, so let's go back to Gradebook driver and see what happens. Notice now, after graduation, Greg has become a senior, Jenna has become a sophomore, Brandy has become a junior, and now there are only 3 students left in my gradebook. Well, if you're exhausted, that's because this has been some very, very hard slogging. We have just done some incredible work here. We have created a gradebook that contains an array of a class, and we've made it so we can add an element to the class and we can remove elements. Let's do one last step to thoroughly test our software and see if it works in all cases. Recall that the way we've written it, we should be able to delete everybody from the list. So what we're going to do here is we're going to, let's see, we're going to say for int year equals 0, year is less than 10, year plus plus, and repeat this whole process 10 years in a row. After let's just shrink that to 5 years. After the first 5 years, how many students should we have remaining? Well, we should have 0. Let's see if our code works under these strange conditions. Let's look at what we have for our output now. Okay. So, if we start at the top here, we had our gradebook had Aaron, Ken, Greg, Jenna, Brandy. There were 5. Then we graduated and we were left with 3. Then our gradebook had Greg, Jenna, Brandy, and then we graduated and we were left with Jenna and Brandy. Then we graduated and we were left with Jenna. Then Jenna graduated and there was 1 student in the gradebook. Then we graduated. And look, we had 0 students in our gradebook, but notice our program did not crash because we wrote it in a robust way that detected all of the possible conditions that could cause an error along the way. Now, we could go back into our gradebook driver here. Let's shrink that back down. And let's just say that after our loop here, we decided to add a new student when we were done. That is, let's see, Jason Sylvester, and he'll come in as a 9th grader, and he is going to be a gender male student. And then let's repeat our loop one more time. So after graduating all of our students and having no students for a couple years, we get 1 new student and add them back to our gradebook. So now we can add and remove students at any time. Very good. Congratulations, you have completed a very complex lesson. Check the assignments to see what other things you should add to your gradebook for the assignment for this week.